covered my wife's family luxury vacation, but my sister-in-law excluded me from family photos and activities. When she expected me to pick up her tab at checkout, I insisted she pay her own way. When Laura first suggested a family vacation to Miami Beach, I thought it was a fantastic idea. Her father's health was declining, and the chance to bring everyone together in a warm, relaxing setting seemed perfect. Laura and I decided to cover all the expenses, from flights and hotel accommodations to meals and excursions. Her parents had always been kind to me, and the idea of making this trip as easy and joyful as possible for them felt like a no-brainer. Even Laura's sister, Jenna, who was going through a tough time financially, was invited along, expenses covered. I believed that, for once, this family vacation could create good memories for all of us. But from the moment we landed, it became clear that Jenna had a different vision for this trip. She acted as if this vacation was crafted solely around her enjoyment, and her energy was, to put it mildly, overbearing. She monopolized every conversation, setting herself up as the director of our family vacation by making plans without consulting anyone. Laura and I would be chatting with her parents about heading to the beach, only for Jenna to interrupt with her own agenda. "We should try the restaurant by the boardwalk," she'd say, then turn to Laura. "Just us girls, Mom would love it." She'd beam, directing everyone into her plans and leaving me standing there, clearly sidelined. Laura noticed, of course, and tried to include me in the plans, but every time she did, Jenna brushed her off with comments like, "Oh, we'll all get together later. It's just a quick thing with family." And as the days went by, Jenna's dominance of the trip only became more obvious. It was as if, despite Laura and me paying for everything, Jenna had appointed herself the star of the show, leaving me to feel like an invisible observer. Even group photos became a point of contention. Jenna made a show of arranging family-only pictures at every scenic spot. Sunsets on the beach, dinner tables at high-end restaurants, poolside lounges. And somehow, I was always relegated to taking the photo. "Could you snap a few of us?" she'd ask, handing me her phone and pulling the family in tight, leaving a noticeable space where I would have stood if she'd allowed me. I'd laugh it off, chalking it up to Jenna's exuberance. But each time I snapped another shot of my in-laws smiling together, the feeling that I was an outsider grew stronger. Laura tried once or twice to encourage Jenna to let me join, suggesting, "How about one with all of us?" Jenna would respond with a smile, but then she'd adjust the group to exclude me anyway, always under some pretext. "Oh, let's just get one with Mom and Dad first," she'd say, then, "Oh, we should do just the siblings." As much as Laura tried, Jenna's intentions were clear. She wanted the pictures to look like a family trip, with no sign of me. I kept my cool, determined not to ruin the trip with confrontation. I could tell Laura was getting more frustrated on my behalf, catching my glances or the little sighs I couldn't quite contain when Jenna brushed me off. Laura squeezed my hand when we'd walk back to our room after a long day, giving me a look that told me she saw it too. But I didn't want to turn what was supposed to be a celebration of her father into a battleground. I figured that as long as Laura and I still got to spend time together, I could handle a few awkward exclusions. I convinced myself that Jenna's actions were just her way of feeling significant, especially in a family where she often relied on others to support her. Still, the atmosphere Jenna created left me on edge. I was part of the family, or so I thought. We were here because Laura and I had made this possible, and yet every time I attempted to participate, it felt like Jenna was finding ways to keep me on the outside looking in. After a while, even my casual jokes about being the photographer of the trip started to fall flat, as I began to feel more invisible than ever. By the second day, I could tell this trip was not going to be the joyful bonding experience we'd imagined. It wasn't just the photos and activities, though. It was the little comments Jenna made when she thought no one was listening. I overheard her talking to her mother as they walked ahead of me on the boardwalk, saying, "This is really a special family moment. I'm so glad it's just us making memories." Her mother nodded, and I was left wondering if they thought I didn't belong in that special family memory at all. By the second day, Jenna's determination to control the vacation had escalated into a full-blown exclusion strategy. From the moment we stepped out for breakfast, she was setting up photo ops like she was directing a film, and each one had an unspoken rule. I was the photographer, not part of the cast. It didn't matter if we were at the beach, dining out, or lounging by the pool. If there was a family moment, Jenna would flash her phone my way and say, "Can you get a few shots of us?" The first time it happened, I took it as an honest oversight. But after the third time, standing there as the family photographer while they arranged themselves for the perfect group shot, I realized it was deliberate. Jenna flashed me a quick smile as she handed over her phone, positioning herself center stage with Laura and her parents. always turning her back to me as if I were nothing more than the help. Each time, she'd assure me, "We'll get one with you in a bit," but the invitation never came. By the end of that morning, I was beginning to feel more like a tour guide than a brother-in-law. Laura picked up on the tension fast, visibly annoyed by Jenna's antics. After lunch, she tried to address it, pulling Jenna aside as I lingered by the boardwalk. "Why don't we take some with everyone? You know, all of us together?" I heard her say, her tone firm but calm. Jenna's response was dismissive. She shrugged, throwing her hands up as if it were nothing, and said, "Oh, I didn't mean anything by it. It's just a family thing." Her words stung more than I expected. A family thing? We had invited her, paid for her, and yet here I was being treated like an outsider in my own vacation. I watched as Laura shook her head, clearly unhappy with her sister's response, but unsure how to push further without causing a scene. By the time we reached the pool later that afternoon, Jenna's attitude had become impossible to ignore. She was orchestrating shots by the cabanas, telling everyone where to stand and ensuring that every photo looked picture-perfect. But every single time, I was kept out of the frame. When Laura suggested one of the whole group, Jenna brushed her off with a quick, "Let's just get one with us and Mom and Dad for now." I bit my tongue, trying to keep calm. I didn't want to sour the mood, especially with Laura's parents right there. But the disrespect was blatant, and it was wearing on me. Here we were on a vacation I had funded out of kindness, and yet I was relegated to the background, the guy holding everyone's bags and snapping their family photos. For every smile that Jenna flashed in front of the camera, I felt a pang of irritation rise within me, a reminder that she was taking advantage of both my generosity and my patience. By dinner, the tension between Laura and Jenna was palpable. I could see Laura shooting her sister sidelong glances, and Jenna, seemingly oblivious, continued her one-woman show. Even as we ordered our food, she made it clear who she thought was in charge, suggesting dishes for everyone, guiding the conversation back to herself, and setting up yet another photo opportunity when dessert arrived. And once again, I was asked to capture the moment. "Are we ever going to get one with everyone?" Laura asked, a bite in her voice as she glanced between me and Jenna. Jenna feigned surprise. "Oh, sure. Maybe tomorrow." She waved it off like it was no big deal. But by then, I was done giving her the benefit of the doubt. I stayed silent, focusing on my food, but the irritation simmered under the surface, especially as Jenna kept ordering dishes and drinks like the vacation was her personal treat. That night, back in our room, Laura and I finally had a moment alone. She apologized profusely, her frustration as clear as mine. "She's treating you like an outsider," she said, frowning. "I don't know what her problem is, but it's like she's trying to turn this trip into some exclusive family memory, minus you. It's like she doesn't realize I'm even a part of this family," I replied, feeling the words sting as I said them. "We came here for your parents, for all of us, and she's acting like I'm just the hired help. It's humiliating." Laura reached for my hand, and though I could see she was angry, I knew she was caught between supporting me and keeping peace with her sister. "I'll talk to her again," she promised. "But just know that I'm on your side here." Her words were comforting, but as I lay in bed that night, I wondered how much longer I could keep my frustration in check without confronting Jenna myself. It was becoming obvious that her family-only photos weren't just an oversight. They were a reflection of how she viewed me, and I was growing more certain that I couldn't let this treatment slide. As the night drew on, I knew this vacation was about to turn into anything but the family bonding trip we'd intended. By the third day, the underlying tension had only grown. Laura and I had originally planned to spend the afternoon together at a trendy beachside restaurant we'd both been excited to try. It was supposed to be our little escape from the whirlwind that Jenna was creating. But somehow, Jenna caught wind of it, and she quickly turned the entire outing into an exclusive girls' lunch with Laura and their mom, leaving me out again. Jenna's reasoning was flimsy at best. She claimed the restaurant was too cramped to fit another person, though I suspected her real intent was to have a family lunch without me. It was as though every chance she got, she found a way to exclude me. This wasn't just about photos anymore. It was about making sure I didn't participate at all. Jenna's complete disregard for me was becoming impossible to ignore, and Laura's apologies, while appreciated, couldn't erase the sting. As I watched the three of them head out, chatting and laughing like I didn't exist, I sat back on a beach chair, feeling the weight of my irritation settle in. Laura later texted me, clearly uncomfortable with how the lunch plans had changed. "I'm sorry, babe." Jenna just went ahead and insisted. "I didn't want to make a scene," she wrote, and I could sense her frustration bleeding through the screen. I told her it was fine, that I understood, but as I looked out at the beach, the bitterness began to build. How many more of these family moments would I be left out of? When Laura returned from lunch, she tried to downplay the outing, though I could tell by her tone that she was annoyed with Jenna too. She just insisted on it being a girl's thing. She explained, sitting down beside me, her expression apologetic. I swear, I tried to get her to invite you, but she just wouldn't let it go. I took a deep breath, trying to shrug it off. It's all right, Laura. I get it. I'm the tag-along, right? I attempted to laugh it off, but I knew she could hear the frustration in my voice. I could see that Laura felt trapped, torn between loyalty to me and her sister. We had come here to make memories with her family, to celebrate her dad, and yet Jenna was turning the entire experience into her own private affair, making sure I was reminded at every turn that I wasn't truly family. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. Jenna's actions were starting to taint what was supposed to be a joyful vacation. As evening came and we all gathered around the hotel's fire pit, I watched as Jenna again took charge of the conversation, steering it away from any mention of me. Each time I chimed in, she'd redirect, talking over me or brushing my comments aside. It was as if she had rewritten the trip's narrative to place herself at the center while erasing me from it entirely. Laura noticed my frustration and leaned over, squeezing my hand in silent support. Her quiet, frustrated glances toward Jenna made it clear she was reaching her own limits with her sister's behavior. But even her silent support couldn't fully erase the feeling of being a stranger in what was supposed to be our own shared family moment. I found myself mentally counting the days until this trip was over, a bitter thought I hadn't expected to have when we'd first planned the vacation. That night, as we walked back to our room, Laura sighed, exasperated. I don't know what her problem is, she muttered. It's like she's intentionally pushing you out, and she's not even being subtle about it. She shook her head, clearly disappointed. I knew how much this vacation meant to her, how much she had wanted it to be a positive, memory-filled trip for everyone, and I hated that it was turning into such a mess. I don't know either, I replied, keeping my voice steady. It's just frustrating. We've done everything to make this easy for everyone, and Jenna treats me like I'm not even here. Laura sighed again, shaking her head. I'm going to talk to her, she promised, though I could sense her uncertainty. Jenna had always been the dominant personality, and I knew Laura didn't want to risk a blowout on a trip meant for her dad's enjoyment. But I was grateful she understood, and that night, as we lay in bed, I began to think about how much I'd already done to make this trip happen, and how much I was still giving up to keep the peace. As I drifted off to sleep, I resolved to let it slide one more day, hoping that maybe Jenna would ease up. But deep down, I suspected things would only get worse before they got better. And I was right. The fourth day of the trip, I planned something special for everyone. A private catamaran ride along Miami's stunning coastline. It was an experience I knew Laura's parents would love, a chance to relax on the open water with sweeping views of the city skyline. I thought maybe, just maybe, this outing would be different, a chance for all of us to unwind and enjoy each other's company without any of the strained dynamics that had marked the previous days. I hoped the beauty of the ocean might even soften Jenna's attitude. But from the moment we boarded, Jenna picked up right where she'd left off. She immediately took over, acting as though she had organized the entire day. She barely acknowledged me as she wrangled everyone into position for a round of photos. All right, let's get a nice family shot by the railing, she chirped, flashing her camera my way with a pointed smile. Could you get a few shots for us? I stood there, holding back my frustration as I snapped photo after photo of Jenna posing with Laura, their parents, and the ocean stretching behind them. When I asked if I could join the next one, Jenna smiled, then waved it off as if I'd suggested something silly. Oh, we'll get one with you later, she said airily. Right now, it's just family. It was an echo of her usual refrain, but this time, the way she said it carried a sharper sting. Right now, it's just family. I realized then that Jenna truly didn't see me as part of this family. No matter that Laura and I had been married for years, no matter that we had paid for this entire trip. Something snapped inside me. All the exclusion, all the small humiliations she had engineered had led up to this moment, and I felt my patience dissolve. Here I was, funding her dream vacation, trying to make things special for Laura's parents, and Jenna couldn't even be bothered to treat me with an ounce of respect. I glanced at Laura, who looked visibly embarrassed, her grip tightening on my hand. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice strained with frustration. This isn't fair to you. I'll talk to her again. But this time, I shook my head, giving her a reassuring squeeze. It's all right, Laura. I'll handle it myself. I kept my voice calm, but my mind was already racing with how I planned to make this right. Jenna had shown me, time and again, that she wouldn't change her behavior. She saw me as the financier of her luxury getaway, not as her brother-in-law, and I'd had enough. My resolve hardened as I looked out over the water, determined that Jenna's entitled behavior would have consequences. As we sailed back to shore, I felt a quiet calm settle over me. I had made up my mind. Jenna's actions had cost me any desire to extend goodwill to her any longer. I knew exactly how to make her pay her share. This wasn't about the money anymore. It was about standing up for myself after days of blatant disrespect. If she wanted to act like I wasn't family, she could handle her own expenses like anyone else. That evening, as we all returned to the hotel, Jenna seemed completely oblivious to the tension she'd created. She was beaming as she recounted her perfect day on the boat, clearly reveling in what she likely saw as a well-earned indulgence. Laura looked at me with concern, sensing that something was different. I gave her a small smile, silently letting her know that everything was under control. She returned a hesitant nod, but I could see the worry in her eyes. In our room later that night, I shared my plan with Laura. I explained that at checkout, I would be separating Jenna's expenses from ours. She's made it clear she doesn't consider me family, I said, my tone resolute. She'll have to cover her own costs. Laura was quiet for a moment, and then she nodded, her face a mixture of relief and agreement. I support you, she said finally. She needs to understand that this kind of behavior isn't okay. I hope she realizes the damage she's done. I knew Jenna might not see the lesson right away, but that didn't matter. I wasn't doing this to teach her. I was doing it to remind myself that I deserved respect. This vacation was supposed to be about togetherness, about creating memories, and if Jenna couldn't see that, then she was going to face the consequences of her selfishness. The final morning arrived, and as I packed my things, I felt a sense of anticipation. The week had been filled with so many small slights, so much casual disrespect, that I felt no hesitation as we headed to the front desk to check out. Laura gave me a reassuring look as we stood in line. She knew how much this moment meant to me, how important it was to take a stand after everything I'd put up with. When we reached the counter, I asked the hotel staff to separate our charges. I'd cover the expenses for Laura, her parents, and myself, but as for Jenna, every meal, every room charge, every poolside cocktail would be her responsibility. I'd even made sure to double-check her charges the night before, a long list that included extras she'd indulged in with the confidence that I would be footing the bill. As Jenna stepped up to the counter, I could see the exact moment she realized what was happening. Her eyes widened as the total flashed on the screen. She took a small, shocked breath, her face paling as she processed the number. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice a mix of confusion and indignation. "I thought you were covering everything." I kept my tone calm, a faint smile on my face. "Well, Jenna," I replied evenly, "since I was excluded from most of the activities you organized, I thought it was only fair that you handle your own expenses. After all, it seems like this was more your trip than ours." Her face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. She looked around as if expecting someone to step in and save her, but Laura's parents remained silent, clearly uncomfortable. Laura stood by my side, arms crossed, silently supporting my decision. Jenna's bravado faltered, and her voice lost some of its usual confidence as she stammered. But my card," she fumbled in her bag, pulling out her wallet and handing over her card with an air of forced calm. The cashier swiped it once, then again, and each time, the screen returned with a flat, decisive beep of rejection. "Declined." Jenna's face went beet red as she realized her card wouldn't cover the charges. The confidence in her voice gave way to desperation. "This must be a mistake," she mumbled, flustered as she grabbed her phone and called her husband, hurriedly explaining that she needed an urgent transfer. As she fidgeted by the counter, explaining the situation in a strained whisper to her husband, I felt a sense of justice settle over me. It wasn't about the money. Covering her expenses hadn't been a hardship, but watching her disregard me time and again had been. Now, watching her scramble to fix a problem of her own making, I felt I'd finally reclaimed some of the dignity she'd spent the week chipping away. Jenna finished the call, visibly flustered as she confirmed her payment with the staff. She refused to look in my direction, mumbling about the unexpected expense as she gathered her things. The tension was thick as we all made our way to the lobby to wait for the car to the airport. Laura's parents were silent, clearly processing the shift in dynamic, and Laura gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. I could tell she was proud of me for standing my ground. On the ride to the airport, Jenna remained stonily silent, her eyes fixed out the window. It was clear she felt humiliated, but the reality was that this situation had been of her own making. She had taken advantage of my generosity and my patience, assuming I'd stay quiet and compliant no matter how she treated me. Today, she'd seen that her actions had consequences. As we arrived at the airport, Laura leaned over and whispered, "I'm glad you stood up for yourself." She needed to hear that. I nodded, feeling a quiet sense of closure. Jenna could think what she wanted, twist the story however she chose, but I had reclaimed my dignity and respect, and that was worth far more than the vacation expenses. That moment of justice left me with a bittersweet satisfaction. Though the trip hadn't gone as planned, I knew I'd finally asserted my place in Laura's family in a way that couldn't be overlooked. And if Jenna learned anything from it, perhaps the next family trip would look a little different. The drive home was quiet, the tension hanging thick in the air like an unwelcome companion. Jenna had slunk off at the airport with barely a word to anyone, her embarrassment at the checkout still fresh in everyone's minds. Laura was beside me, her hand resting in mine, but I could tell she was still processing everything that had unfolded. As the silence stretched on, she finally broke it, glancing over at me with a small, supportive smile. "You handled that better than I could have," she said, giving my hand a squeeze. Jenna needed that wake-up call. Her words felt like validation, and I nodded, feeling a flicker of relief that she truly understood my decision. But I could also see the worry in her eyes, the anxiety of how this might affect family dynamics going forward. This wasn't how either of us had pictured ending the trip, and we both knew that once Jenna's initial embarrassment faded, she'd find a way to twist the story. Laura looked at me, her expression pensive. "I'm just glad it's over," she sighed, leaning back in her seat. "But it'll be interesting to see how this plays out with my parents." I glanced back in the rearview mirror at her parents, who sat quietly in the back seat. They hadn't said much since we left the hotel, but I caught the looks they'd exchanged during the checkout fiasco, the quiet glances of disappointment that said more than words could. Laura's dad, especially, had seemed deeply affected. He'd always had a good relationship with Jenna, but after witnessing her attitude throughout the week and the way she'd taken advantage, he looked hurt. I suspected he'd have words with her soon, though I couldn't predict what that conversation might look like. As we continued down the highway, Laura and I began to talk through the week's events, recounting every awkward moment, every disrespectful comment, every instance of being pushed aside. It was as though the car became a safe space for us to finally say all the things we'd held back. I shared how it wasn't just about the money, but about the principle of the situation. I had opened my wallet and my patience to make this trip special, only to be treated as an afterthought. Laura listened intently, nodding as I laid out my frustrations, agreeing that Jenna's behavior had been both hurtful and entitled. When we hit a stretch of road with no traffic, Laura sighed. "It's crazy how a simple act of generosity somehow got turned around like this." She looked over at me, her expression a mixture of exasperation and sadness. "But I think it's the first time Jenna's really had to face consequences for the way she treats people. And even if she doesn't admit it, she knows it's her own doing." I couldn't help but feel a wave of relief that Laura was with me on this, that she understood how badly her sister's behavior had affected me. Her words reassured me that taking a stand hadn't been selfish. It had been necessary. We drove on in a reflective silence, each of us caught up in our own thoughts about how this trip had started with such promise and ended so far from where we'd intended. Finally, Laura spoke, voicing something we'd both been thinking. "You know, I think Jenna's used to being the center of attention, always taking without thinking. She probably thought she could get away with it forever." She paused, looking out at the road, her eyes distant. "I just wonder how this is going to affect things. You know how she can be when she feels slighted." I nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. Jenna's reaction to being confronted had always been deflection and retaliation. I doubted she would reflect on her behavior with any humility. More likely, she'd go on the defensive, twisting the story to paint herself as the victim. This wasn't the end of it. I knew that much. Jenna's entitlement had gone unchecked for so long that this simple act of holding her accountable would inevitably spark repercussions. Laura seemed to read my thoughts. She gave my hand a final squeeze, her voice soft but resolute. "No matter what happens, I'm with you. You did the right thing, and I won't let Jenna twist this against you." Her support was a balm for everything I'd endured, and I felt the tension in my chest ease, knowing I wasn't alone in this. As the city skyline came into view, a sense of finality washed over me. I didn't know exactly what fallout awaited us, but for the first time in a week, I felt in control of my own narrative. I had drawn a line, shown that my kindness wasn't a blank check for disrespect, and whatever came next, I was ready to face it with Laura by my side. It didn't take long after we returned home for the ripple effects of the Miami trip to start spreading. Jenna, it turned out, wasted no time in telling her version of events. She painted herself as the blindsided victim, claiming that I had humiliated her by forcing her to pay a bill she couldn't afford. Family members who hadn't been there began reaching out, some disappointed and others outright criticizing me for what they called a cruel move, saying it was wrong of me to embarrass Jenna like that. The messages stung, especially those from relatives I respected. A few bluntly asked why I would invite Jenna on a trip only to punish her. Each call seemed to tell a more twisted version of the story, and Laura and I found ourselves rehashing the events to anyone who would listen. Laura took to her phone, spending hours clarifying our side, carefully explaining that Jenna had treated me like an outsider, ignoring every gesture of generosity we'd extended, and that asking her to cover her own expenses was an attempt to set boundaries, not to shame her. Thankfully, not everyone bought into Jenna's tale of betrayal. Laura's parents were supportive, with her dad even calling me to say he admired the way I'd finally stood up for myself. She needed that reality check, he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. You know, we always hoped Jenna would learn to appreciate the people around her. I think she may finally understand that her behavior has consequences. His words gave me a sense of validation that I hadn't expected, and I could tell he'd seen through Jenna's attempts to cast herself as the wrong party. He was angry, and I knew that deep down, he felt the sting of her entitlement as much as I did. But Jenna wasn't giving up her version of events so easily. She called extended family members, dramatizing every detail, framing herself as the one who'd been wronged. Messages from cousins and aunts trickled in, each echoing some form of Jenna's story, expressing concern over how things had played out. It didn't matter how calmly or clearly Laura tried to set the record straight. Jenna's refusal to accept any responsibility kept the narrative muddled. Laura spent hours on damage control, working to explain the situation in a way that didn't make her sister look worse, but showed the truth of how we had been treated. It wasn't all negative. Several family members reached out privately, telling me they understood why I'd done what I did. Jenna's always been like that, one cousin admitted. Honestly, it's about time someone put her in her place. Others echoed similar sentiments, noting that Jenna had always felt entitled to things that weren't hers, and that perhaps this would finally help her see the impact of her behavior. These messages helped balance out the criticisms, offering a glimpse of understanding that made me feel like I wasn't entirely alone in the mess Jenna had stirred up. Still, the situation only seemed to grow more complicated. Jenna dug her heels in, doubling down on her story, calling Laura and accusing her of choosing sides and betraying their sisterly bond. It hurt Laura to hear her sister say those things, especially knowing how much effort she had put into making the trip special for their parents. Laura broke down one night, frustrated and exhausted from trying to defend our actions to family members who only heard Jenna's version of events. She looked at me, her eyes filled with hurt. "She doesn't understand what she's done," she whispered. "She just can't see how selfish she's being." It became clear that Jenna's inability to take responsibility for her behavior would only deepen the rift within the family. I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because I knew I'd done the right thing by standing up for myself, and sadness because it had brought such strain to Laura's family. Despite the criticism, I held my ground. For the first time in years, I wasn't just putting up with mistreatment, I was asserting my right to be respected. The family dynamics shifted as Jenna's complaints rippled through the extended family, creating division and tension. It seemed that this situation had forced people to take sides, and while Laura and I found support from those who understood, Jenna's story left others feeling uncertain. The weeks that followed were filled with calls, some supporting us, others subtly pressuring us to smooth things over with Jenna. But I couldn't bring myself to back down. Ultimately, I realized that Jenna's refusal to take any responsibility was a sign of her own immaturity. She'd spent her life avoiding consequences, manipulating situations to her advantage. And perhaps, for the first time, she was faced with a reality she couldn't twist entirely in her favor. It wasn't what I'd hoped for when we planned the trip, but I was learning to accept that this outcome, however messy, had given me back a sense of control and dignity I hadn't felt in a long time. Thanksgiving arrived with a tension that was almost tangible. Laura and I walked into her parents' house, knowing that the Miami fiasco still lingered over everyone like a dark cloud. Jenna was already there, seated at the table with her husband, and though she barely looked my way, I could see the cold glint of resentment in her eyes. Laura gave my hand a reassuring squeeze as we made our way to our seats, both of us silently bracing for whatever was about to unfold. At first, dinner was a careful dance. Laura's mom tried her best to keep conversation light, focusing on food and harmless family updates, but Jenna sat sullenly, picking at her plate with her fork and making snide remarks under her breath. Her husband, visibly uncomfortable, kept glancing at her, a silent plea in his eyes for her to drop it. But Jenna couldn't help herself. She seemed determined to rehash the Miami trip, angling for sympathy from anyone who would listen. Halfway through dinner, she began her performance in earnest, sighing dramatically before remarking, I'm still shocked by how unfairly I was treated in Miami. I was invited and then humiliated over a bill I was told would be covered. I can't believe how some people," her eyes flicked in my direction as she trailed off, ensuring that her insinuations hit their mark. She was playing the victim, as she'd done countless times, but now her words had an even sharper edge. Laura shot her a warning look, but Jenna continued. "It's just that families should support each other, not make each other feel excluded. I don't think that's too much to ask," she added, her tone dripping with self-righteousness. Her husband gently tried to steer her back to a neutral topic, but Jenna brushed him off, determined to make her point. And then, Laura's dad finally reached his limit. He put his fork down, looking directly at Jenna with an expression I'd never seen from him before, disappointment mixed with frustration. "Enough, Jenna," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I think it's time you took a look at your own actions for once. You were ungrateful and exclusionary in Miami, and it wasn't right. Your entitlement and treatment of others have been beyond disrespectful." His voice didn't waver as he continued. "The least you could have done was show some gratitude instead of pushing people away and then blaming them when they finally stood up for themselves." Jenna froze, her mouth open in shock. She hadn't expected her father, who'd always given her the benefit of the doubt, to call her out in front of everyone. Her face turned bright red, and I could see her struggling for a response, but she was clearly rattled, unprepared for the directness of his disappointment. The silence that followed was thick, everyone at the table too stunned to speak. Finally, Jenna pushed her chair back, mumbling something about needing a moment, and quickly left the room. Her husband, looking both embarrassed and apologetic, tried to smooth things over. "I'm so sorry," he muttered, his face turning pink as he apologized to Laura's dad, then to me. "She's been frustrated about everything. I'll talk to her." The rest of dinner was quiet, everyone picking at their food, processing the shift in the family dynamic that had just unfolded. Jenna's carefully constructed narrative of victimhood had been publicly dismantled, and it was clear that even her father, who had always taken her side, had reached his breaking point. Laura's mom looked torn, her face a mixture of relief and sadness, and Laura gave me a small, supportive smile, as if to say that this was the accountability Jenna had needed all along. After dinner, as everyone was cleaning up, Jenna reappeared briefly, her face tight with anger. She didn't speak to me or Laura, but I could feel the intensity of her resentment as she brushed past us. Her father's words had clearly hit her hard, and I suspected she wouldn't let them go anytime soon. As Laura and I prepared to leave, her dad pulled me aside, his voice quiet but sincere. "Thank you for handling things the way you did in Miami," he said, a note of regret in his voice. "I'm sorry it had to come to this, but Jenna needed to hear it. And honestly, it's been a long time coming. We left Thanksgiving feeling the weight of everything that had happened." Laura leaned into me as we walked to the car, a sense of closure settling over us. Jenna's behavior had finally reached a breaking point, and though it had caused a rift in the family, it was a necessary one. For the first time, I felt that Laura's parents truly saw how much I'd put up with, and knowing that they were on our side made all the difference. In the months after our Miami trip, we began hearing stories from mutual friends that painted an unexpected picture of Jenna's life at home. The fallout from the trip seemed to extend far beyond our family dynamic. Rumors of strain in Jenna's marriage began circulating. Initially, Laura and I tried to ignore the whispers, but as more people mentioned it, we realized that the trip might have opened Jenna's eyes to a lifestyle that her husband couldn't afford to provide. Jenna had caught a glimpse of luxury, and it had ignited something inside her, an obsession with keeping up appearances, even if it came at a cost she couldn't manage. From what we gathered, Jenna's husband was beginning to feel the pressure of her escalating expectations. The catamaran outing, the fine dining, and even the upscale hotel had fueled Jenna's hunger for a lifestyle they simply weren't equipped to maintain. She began pushing him to upgrade their home, to take more vacations, to buy the things she felt would reflect the image she wanted to project. It was as though she couldn't separate the vacation from reality, demanding that her husband bring that level of extravagance into their everyday lives. The strain became clear when Jenna's husband reached out to Laura's parents for advice, opening up about his frustrations. He admitted that Jenna's demands were causing frequent arguments, with each disagreement revealing more cracks in their relationship. Laura's dad, who had already been grappling with his disappointment over Jenna's Miami behavior, was heartbroken to hear how her entitlement was affecting her marriage. The daughter he'd once seen as driven and self-sufficient was now consumed by a sense of entitlement that was driving her marriage to a breaking point. He confided in Laura one evening, expressing his regret. "I hoped that Jenna would come to her senses after Miami," he said with a sigh, "but it seems like it's only made things worse." Laura and I exchanged a knowing look as we processed the news. The irony wasn't lost on us. Jenna's insistence on being the center of attention, her disregard for boundaries, and her obsession with appearances had all come full circle. Our generous offer to cover the Miami trip had, in a twisted way, exposed a side of her that her husband hadn't fully seen before. Now, faced with the reality that he couldn't keep up with her expectations, he was beginning to question whether their marriage could withstand the constant demands. It was a strange feeling. Though I felt sympathy for her husband and could sense the pain in Laura's father's words, I couldn't ignore the irony. Jenna's entitlement had backfired, and it was becoming painfully obvious to those around her. In a way, Miami had shone a light on something Jenna had managed to keep hidden behind charm and wit for so long. Her need for control, her sense of superiority, and her unyielding appetite for attention had finally caught up with her. Laura and I tried to stay out of the unfolding drama, but it was hard to ignore the steady stream of updates we received from her parents. Each conversation revealed more about the struggles Jenna and her husband were facing. Arguments over finances, the resentment her husband felt as he watched Jenna push their budget to its limits, and the mounting frustration as she continued to blame others for her unhappiness. For Laura's parents, it was difficult to watch, knowing that the daughter they had always tried to support was now sowing discord in her own home. Over time, the family began to understand the true cost of Jenna's entitlement. Her husband's struggles and her parents' disappointment were testament to the impact her behavior was having on everyone around her. I didn't revel in their difficulties. In fact, there was a part of me that felt genuinely sad for the toll it was taking on Laura's parents, especially her dad. But I couldn't ignore the fact that this situation had forced everyone to confront a side of Jenna they had overlooked or excused for years. In the end, the Miami trip had exposed more than just Jenna's selfish behavior. It had highlighted the deep-seated issues that had been festering in her personal life all along. And while I didn't know what the future held for her or her marriage, one thing was clear. Jenna's actions had finally caught up with her. Whether she'd ever acknowledge it or not, the consequences were there for everyone to see. In the months following the Miami trip, the family gradually settled back into an uneasy normalcy, though the fracture between Jenna and the rest of us was undeniable. Jenna's marriage continued to face challenges, her husband visibly worn down by the pressure to meet her ever-rising expectations. Laura's parents, too, seemed changed, their disappointment in Jenna clouding interactions that had once been filled with pride and optimism. Laura and I chose to distance ourselves from the tension, redirecting our energy toward the people and activities that brought us genuine joy. It was a difficult but important lesson for both of us. We learned that kindness and generosity, while powerful, don't obligate us to tolerate mistreatment. Our choice to fund the trip had come from a place of love and excitement, but the experience taught us the need for boundaries, especially when dealing with someone who saw generosity as an invitation for control. Laura and I grew closer as we processed what happened, drawing strength from the shared decision to stand up for ourselves, even if it meant going against family expectations. We still traveled with family, but our trips were smaller and far more intentional. We kept the company of people who truly respected and valued us, and every journey felt more meaningful because we weren't navigating Jenna's entitlement. Laura's parents, while still involved in our lives, seemed to approach us with a new level of understanding. Her dad, especially, made an effort to check in with us, expressing how much he appreciated our kindness and regretted how things had turned out with Jenna. Though his relationship with her remained strained, he continued to try and guide her, hoping she'd eventually come to see the importance of humility and gratitude. For Laura and me, the Miami incident became a turning point in our lives. It was the first time we had firmly set boundaries, choosing to protect our peace over placating others. This decision wasn't without its painful moments, but each time I remembered the week's events, I knew I'd made the right choice. Jenna's actions had been a painful but valuable reminder of the importance of self-respect, and the experience empowered me to draw lines I hadn't known I needed. As the years went on, we became selective with our invitations to family events, maintaining relationships on our own terms. Jenna's presence remained a sensitive topic, especially for Laura's parents, but we'd come to terms with the fact that she would never see things the way we did. She still insisted on her version of events, but with time, her influence over the family diminished, and her dramatizations became background noise in a life we were happier and more grounded in. Looking back, I didn't regret standing up to Jenna. While the situation had led to discomfort and tension, it ultimately strengthened Laura and me, solidifying our understanding of boundaries and the type of family environment we wanted to build. We found a new sense of peace, one rooted in respect and mutual care. And with each passing year, we grew more grateful for the lesson we'd taken from the experience. In the end, I no longer sought Jenna's validation or acceptance. Surrounded by people who genuinely cared and appreciated our presence, I realized that respect and self-worth mattered more than appeasing someone unwilling to meet us halfway. Laura and I moved forward with a deeper connection and a shared resolve to protect our peace. As I looked around at the life we'd built, I knew we'd be just fine without Jenna's approval or her presence. For the first time, I felt free to live on my own terms, knowing that true family is found in those who respect and cherish you. And that finally was enough.